Hi, my name is Alex Cantrell, and I chose to do my critique on the Stanford Binet or Binet intelligence assessment. So for the theoretical basis, the abbreviation is the SB5, and it was revised from the Binet-Simon scale by Louis Terman, and originally was used to diagnose developmental and intellectual deficiencies in children. And the fifth edition that's used now was released in 2003 and was adjusted by Gail Royd. And the 5 factors that this test chooses to focus on are knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual spatial processing, working memory, and fluid reasoning, where the baseline of intelligence or the mean for performance is 100, and the standard deviation is 15. So Binet and Simon categorized children by their age group and tested 4,800 children. And the common level of achievement based on that age group was the mean and considered normal for that age. And any deviation higher or lower indicated a lesser or a higher form of intelligence. Terman was a psychologist at Stanford and adjusted the test for American children and used it to not only identify children with learning disabilities, but also children with a high level of intelligence. And for each of the 5 factors, there is a verbal and nonverbal counterpart to address age and language related variation in developing children and to address fair cultural concerns. So the evidence for the validity of the SV5, content validity was found based on the professional judgment that Gail Royd received during the inception of the SV5 and was validated concerning the fairness of items, item content, and which items assess for giftedness. And construct validity was supported by an exam of age trends and by comparison to previous editions. In terms of reliability, there were numerous reliability tests performed, including a split half reliability, standard error of measure test, plotting of test information curves, test retest reliability, and interscore agreement. And IQ scores for this scale have remained stable and had internal consistency as compared to other tests since its inception. The SV5 was also normed on a stratified random sample of 4,800 individuals, matching the 2000 census, and the scores were at a normal distribution. So in terms of format and administration, as I mentioned earlier, it measures 5 items in a nonverbal and verbal example. And what they mean by these examples are for fluid reasoning, they define it as the ability to solve abstract problems where no prior knowledge is required. And for the nonverbal example, they asked students or kids to do object series matrices. For knowledge, they test someone's accumulation stock of general information. And for a nonverbal example, they focus on visual absurdities. So something that most people would be able to recognize as untrue on a series of images. Quantitative reasoning is math. So for younger kids, it's basic counting. And as they get older, it moves into more word problems and more abstract concepts. For visual spatial reasoning, they're really trying to test out the recognition of patterns with spatial relationships and the ability to recognize the whole from its constituent parts. So a nonverbal example would be puzzles or patterns that the child has to assemble. And then working memory, these are trying to assess the processes that capture and store information into short-term memory. So in a nonverbal example, they might try to ask a student to recall a previously memorized picture, or they might tap out a series on a table and have the child repeat the process of the tapping. Just to continue, there are 2 versions of this test. The abbreviated version takes about 15 to 20 minutes, but the long version takes closer to 60 to 70 minutes. And they both assess the 5 factors, but the 2 domains of nonverbal and verbal are really explored more in the longer version. And I just wanted to include an example of a math question from the test that they give to 5-year-olds. And that's how many blocks do I have if I take 2 blocks away? So they want the child to understand how many blocks there are and how to take 2 away from 4. For the scale and scoring system, there's 60 questions, and each question relates back to one of the 5 domains under either the verbal or nonverbal category. So there's a combination of 10 different types of questions. And the scores translate to the mean being 100 and the standard deviation being 15. Something of note, the questions getting questions wrong don't hurt the test taker. So students are encouraged to guess. And the results are based on the national percentile rank of the children born in a 3-month span. So when you take the test, you're only assessed based on the children that are exactly your age within 3 months. And as you can see on the left here, this is the IQ range, where 100 is average, and then anything above higher than that is considered gifted, anything below that is considered impaired. So for the appropriate population, the SB5 was really designed for children. However, it can be used for any person of any age, especially in older adults as they experience cognitive decline. It can be a helpful tool in assessing level of decline, dementia, presence, that sort of thing. But as the SB5 specifically was much more animated and colorful than previous versions, so it can be used for kids as young as 2 years old to assess early developmental delays. However, they have found that very young children tend to underperform on this test in comparison to other average groups. Their average score is a little bit lower because developmentally they don't have the capacity to finish a 60-question test at 2 years old. So some of that validity is questioned when you use it in younger populations. And this test was developed to target children with deficits intellectually. It can also be used for clinical assessment, educational placement, compensation evaluation, career assessment, neuropsychological treatment, forensics, research, and high IQ societies accept the SB5 as a valid form of entry for anyone that scores higher than a 146. The clinical applications, like I mentioned earlier, it's not only useful in detecting childhood developmental delays and intellectual disabilities, but it also has good predictive capacity for student educational and adult professional success. And it also is helpful in assessing cognitive decline in elderly patients. And IQ is correlated to higher success in school and work and leadership. However, there's so many contributing factors that are also predictors of success. So IQ kind of needs to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. Things like personality, access to networks, work ethic, luck, privilege are all components of success prediction. And not only an IQ is going to be able to tell any sort of predictive, analysis with a huge grade of detail. And even the research I found mentioned that some people with really low IQ scores, like President George W. Bush, are highly successful, obviously, and those with very high IQs can sometimes find others slow, be difficult to work with, feel misunderstood because no one can keep up with them intellectually, and sometimes that can impair their ability to find success in our society. So I found a good amount of ethical and cultural kind of issues with this assessment, especially based in its the theory of intelligence kind of became more famous and more well accepted from eugenicists like Galton and people like Darwin, who encouraged the idea that intelligence was based in genetics. And this has been used against people of color, against women, against the LGBT population for years to say oh, this certain population of white men are smarter than everyone else, therefore we should only be creating more of this smart population and that kind of thing. So just in general, this is all based on a very narrow idea of what intelligence means. So again, the results need to be taken with care and sensitivity, and also with the idea of where they've stemmed from originally. And also the view and value of intelligence in society has been largely shaped by IQ tests, and the results have been misused by organizations since their inception. Counselors have a responsibility to handle the results of this assessment, as well as explain them to the client in a way that is helpful and not, triggering in any way, that sort of thing. As I mentioned earlier too, the scores consistently, even with all of the reviews and peer editing and in general, the tests that this specific tests have to pass to make it into the public, they're finding that for whatever reason, scores continually hold POC about 15 points lower than white people in these tests. And for whatever reason, they have not really been able to differentiate why that is. So I think that that's a huge issue in this test in general with people of color and with Hispanic people as well. It scores them about 10 to 15 points lower, even though they've had people of color and, all these extensive reviews holding people of color on these panels to minimize these differences, even when controlling for socioeconomic status, there's still racial differences. So in general, I think that speaks to the reliability and validity of the test in and of itself. But as we, use these assessments in the future as counselors, we just need to be aware of kind of the implications of what these scores really mean. And these are my references. If anyone has any questions or, things to add to the cheat sheet, please let me know. Thank you.